Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the third installment of Untitled Multiculturalisms, our webinar series hosted by the Stephen Lawrence Research Center at Montfort University here in Leicester. I'm Kennetta Hammond-Perry, and I serve as director of the center. Taking Professor Bernard Hesse's groundbreaking edited collections, Untitled Multiculturalisms, as a provocation to think with and through our current global conjuncture. This series is bringing together cutting-edge thinkers, activists, community organizers, and caretakers in critical dialogues that seek to name, diagnose, analyze, critique, interrogate, and upend how we understand how race and the permutations of racism and what my colleague Lisa Palmer has described as global white imperial democracies are lived, endured, and refused, and persistently contested. Tonight, we turn to the tragic disaster of the 2017 fire at Grenfell Tower as a means of making legible the persistence of the violence of the colonial state and its historic routines of rendering Black and Brown life vulnerable to harm, danger, loss of breath, and death. We mourn the known dead and are well aware of the fatalities produced by the Grenfell fire and its aftermath will and should haunt us for generations to come. May we never forget. I'm really pleased to introduce our panelists for tonight's episode. After I introduce all of the panelists, each is going to speak for approximately 7 to 10 minutes. And from there, we will engage in a moderated discussion between the panelists, unpacking some of their ideas, followed by Q&A with the audience. Throughout tonight's episode and conversation, we invite you to share questions and comments in the chat box and welcome you to live tweet using the hashtag UNMC and 2020 transruptions, which you can see going across the screen there. So I'm going to now turn to our speakers. Our first speaker for the evening will be Dr. Adam Elliott Cooper. Adam is a research associate in applied sociology at the University of Greenwich. Adam's scholarly interests include post-colonialism, urban theory, and social movements. His current research focuses on anti-racism and British policing, both on the British mainland and in Britain's colonies. He has a forthcoming book coming out with Manchester University Press later this spring, which I'm really excited about, entitled Black Resistance to British Policing. He also is very active in his community, but also nationally on issues around resistance to the police state in the UK. He sits on the board of the Monitoring Group, which is an anti-racist organization that challenges state racisms and racial violence. Welcome, Adam. Next, we will hear from Dr. Monique Charles. That's fine. Monique is a cultural sociologist, theorist, and methodologist. She developed a research method to analyze and understand music for the social science and cultural studies field. She developed a theory on Black music and spirituality in live performance and in clubbing spaces. She currently is a media reviews editor for the Global Hip Hop Studies Journal, and in her capacity as a sound therapist and healer, she applies meditation and sound for healing and therapeutic purposes. Our next speaker will be Dr. Nadine El-Inani. Nadine teaches and researches at Birkbeck College School of Law and co-directs the Center for Research on Race and Law. She is author of Bordering Britain, Law, Race, and Empire, which was published by Manchester University Press in 2020. And currently she's researching questions of race and justice in death and custody cases, and the role of law in addressing health inequalities arising from environmental harm. Our final speaker for this evening will be Dr. Aminé Saat Das. Amina is a lecturer in politics here at De Montfort University in Leicester. She's affiliated with the Stephen Lawrence Research Center, as well as the Center for Urban Research on Austerity in the Faculty of Business and Law. Amina's research interests include the study of Muslim participation in politics, in French and Belgian politics specifically, and Islamophobia studies, with a particular emphasis on its gender dimensions. She writes regularly around her research interests and has recently published a monograph titled Muslim Women's Political Participation in France and Belgium. Again, I'd like to take a special opportunity to welcome our panelists, and I will now turn to Adam.
Hi, everyone. Just want to begin by saying thank you so much to Lisa, Canetta, and everyone else at the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre for organising this brilliant series of webinars and inviting me to contribute to them. And I was really excited to read Barna Hesse's paper on transruptions, as well as I often am in reading his work, as it's so incisive and thought-provoking and challenging. And it got me thinking about the different ways in which movements across 2020 sought to transrupt Britain's self-image as a historically non-racist white state, and today, at the very best, a non-racist multicultural state. And I think those are two things which have been transrupted in different ways since the Grenfell Tower, and certainly over the course of 2020. And I think this is necessary, part for a myriad of reasons, of course. But I think one of the really important reasons that it's such a necessary intervention is because of the way in which Britain presents itself as a nation which doesn't really do race. Race is this thing that happens in America. The Americans do race. The South Africans used to do race, but they don't anymore. Everything's kind of okay now. But here in Britain, we don't do race. We do class. Class is what we do. And even the more kind of critical appraisals of what took place in Grenfell were able to frame potentially Grenfell as being a working class multicultural community, but still very often framed the issues that were being faced by the people who suffered in Grenfell as being an issue relating to class, not being able to contend with the role that racism plays in these kinds of issues. And while there were many scholars and activists, some of which we'll listen from today, of course, who were able to really coherently articulate the racialized dynamics of what took place in Grenfell, of course, it was far more difficult for them, for the mainstream, for the government, much of the press, and what have you, to ignore Britain's racialized patterns of governance and control and identities in the summer of 2020 with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movements. And I think this was for a number of reasons, and I think it arose in quite interesting ways, which I think Barna picks up on in his paper, and I think are certainly worth dwelling on briefly. I think one of the really interesting ones was the attempt to co-opt, of course, Black Lives Matter. Right? Everybody wanted to be a part of Black Lives Matter. The Premiership wanted to advocate for Black Lives Matter. We all know that a myriad of brands and multinational corporations attempted to do something about Black Lives Matter. I'm sure, as someone whose email inbox began to be filled up very quickly with different organizations and companies and groups who've realized they need to do something after Black Lives Matter, and therefore just send out a myriad of emails to people asking them if they can come into their place of work or their organization and do something. And I think this became particularly interesting for the new head of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, who took a brilliant photo op with himself kneeling, giving the knee, showing his solidarity with this American problem. But when confronted and asked about the quite basic demands of the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the most principal ones being a defunding of the police, eroding society's reliance on the police and prison system, and empowering communities and other forms of care, healing, and social infrastructure, Keir Starmer quickly had to distance himself from this kind of politics. And so what we see here is this attempt to want to embrace the kind of progressive ideals of anti-racism, but not being able to stomach what anti-racism really means. And I think that this bind that Britain finds itself in is one of the contradictions of liberalism more generally. The idea that there are all of these liberal ideas that the nation considers to be fundamental to its national identity. But yet when attempting to enable those liberal ideals for everyone, there becomes a problem, right? There becomes a series of contradictions because the way in which the state and its economy and the entire polity function is premised upon denying liberal rights and freedoms to large swathes of the population. And I think one of the reasons that there has been so much, I think there has been a kind of a slow awakening that's led to these massive mobilizations in the summer of 2020, is the way in which racism has been deployed very, very carefully, but very, very effectively over the last 10 or 20 years in ways that have crept into a range of different areas of public life in Britain. So while Britain is able to very comfortably point the finger at the United States, which is where the real problem lies, they have also been able to incarcerate Black people at the same rate as the United States incarcerates African Americans. While Britain's able to point the finger at the United States as saying this is the place where race happens, Britain is, by contrast, a tolerant nation. It reproduces very similar forms of racialized policing, similar kinds of folk devils like the terrorist, the gangster, the illegal immigrants, all of these kinds of racialized folk devils which lead to the expansion of prisons for undocumented people, or the surveillance and policing of Black communities, or the criminalization of Muslim communities. These are all patterns of racialized policing which have been pioneered in the United States, and for which Britain has adopted in ways which mean that the racism of both Britain and the United States have far more in common than they do, I think, in relation to them being different. And so when we think about the ways in which, I think this is my final thought, the ways in which the transruption of the summer of 2020 also attempted to historicize Britain's racialized histories through the targeting of monuments and statues commemorating and celebrating Britain's imperial rule. We again see a transruption which challenges Britain's attempt to identify itself not what it was, which was the largest slave trading nation in human history, but as what it tells itself it is, which it tells itself it's the country which abolished the transatlantic slave trade. And by demonstrating the connections between these legacies of colonialism and chattel slavery to the very material realities of racism today, from Grenfell to policing to borders and what have you, we see the ways in which these multicultural transruptions are both really fundamentally conceptual in the way they're able to articulate ideas through action, but are also very much material as well, through the ways in which they're able to challenge the myriad of different forms of racialized state violence, which have become so normalized in Britain in the 21st century. And I'll leave it there.
Adam, thank you for that. I think you put a number of issues on the table, particularly in terms of the ways in which 2020 opened up a conversation about sort of how the nation imagines itself and how it positions itself as a kind of, as a non-racist place, or uses the kind of juxtaposition with the US to actually disavow the ways in which the racial state operates in the UK, both historically, but also sort of in its contemporary iteration. So I'm looking forward to picking up more of that conversation in our discussion. Thank you for that. I want to turn to Monique.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. And so I was thinking about multicultural transruptions. I was thinking about how race, class, and gender, I suppose, come together under the politics of solidarity, how it can be built or how it can be sustained in the aftermath of Grenfell, but I suppose more connected to my research area, which is more music, music and to some extent art, music, sound and art. And I came to think about space. So I suppose before I continue, I wrote a chapter in After Grenfell, and my role there, I believe at least, was to give voice to community experience, not speaking on behalf of the community affected by the tragedy, and enabling their stories and activities on the ground to reach far and wide, beyond where they could potentially or possibly go, being in the thick of it themselves. But I was thinking about the role of music. So there were songs that were made talking about what had happened, the role of music in terms of building momentum, of building political solidarity. What does that mean and how does that translate? So, Grenfell is obviously a very unique example, being in one of the richest boroughs, North Kensington, being in one of the richest boroughs. Also, the disparity is great, but at the same time, there are some similarities in terms of economic hardship. And again, this is not to negate issues of race here at all, with other parts of Britain, which Stuart Hall refers to as internal colonies. These are places where, in inverted commas, undesirable people have been permitted to live. When it comes to being in the richest borough and being of other race or ethnicity, that becomes a real problem. But again, we come to space, and the idea of space, how space has kind of changed, how our perceptions of space have changed since the edited volume was first brought out 20 years ago, and how we think about space now, and how music operates in these spaces to kind of garner or build a sense of political solidarity around race, class and gender, and also how it's changed and its role in that. And so I think about grime, which was my area of research, and I think about how space, physical space, tangible space, when we think about Grenfell and the surrounding area, especially 1 mile either side of the Westway, that was given to the community as a result of having a motorway basically built over or through your neighbourhood, given to the community, being constantly under threat. Being constantly under threat, coming together to kind of protect space, physical space, is a real issue of concern for people in and around North Kensington, but other places as well, the spaces that you can physically move in. Thinking about music and its potential of transruption, music is non-physical. It's non-physical. It connects to people on an individual level, triggering memories and all sorts of things like that. So with my research, what is music is ultimately what I kind of came to. And music is a sonic footprint timestamp, if it's made organically. It's a representation or articulation of one's existence, ancestry, location, lyrically as well as sonically. All of these things are ways in which people can articulate their identity and spread messages. It's intangible. We think about space and how that has changed in the past 20 years. We now have moved to digital space, also intangible. And we've seen people begin to harness and galvanize this new power, not without problems, of course. The digital space is not without problem or controls, but how people have managed to garner this to push for political solidarity, to stand with others. So you can stand with others in music, you can stand with others in digital space. However, I think the thing that I'm still grappling with is, how does all of that power that is accumulated in this space translate back into physical space? How does it translate into solidarity that can make real changes to internal colonies, real changes for communities and people on the ground? We know music and art can fulfill and nurture and nourish people and give them a cathartic valve, let's say, to continue. But when we think about the physical space, it is governed by systems and structures which the neoliberal climate has begun to kind of privatize and sell off. So there's all these controls and no responsibilities and lots of authority on the people in this space. So thinking about music, thinking about its power to garner, to build solidarity, thinking about digital space to build solidarity, it's very good in the building. The thing that I'm struggling to grapple with is how can it contribute towards sustaining, other than sustaining people in physical space that are pushing and working with or are questioning the structures and the systems that are in place. I suppose, for example, we have digital activism in the sense of, the general election, both general elections, garnering young people who are digitally native. And so we're very early in the stage of digital organizing for political. Thank you. We're in the very early stages of organizing for political, with a capital P, political means. And in relation to structures and systems and physical space and how that is controlled, that has, owing to to our historical, class, race, gender, and all those sort of things, have had structures in place for hundreds of years. So the digital space has a lot to learn. I don't have the answers, but what I think I'm grappling with is the ways in which the non-physical does announce its existence, does transrupt, does speak back to power. But how can that momentum and what is built convert back to these physical spaces that can enable real change? And that's kind of where I am grappling with, and hope that it will give other people things to think about too.
Yes, thank you for that, Monique. There were, like I said, a few things that really stood out for me that I definitely want to follow up on in terms of your point about the power of music and movement building, but also mobilizing certain kinds of solidarities. But also, I think one of the things that's really interesting about this question that you're grappling with is sort of, what space how do different realms operate in relation to one another when we're trying to think about not just building solidarities, but actually operationalizing them and actually sustaining them over the kind of long period. So I really appreciate that intervention and look forward to continuing on that dialogue. I'm going to turn now next to Nadine.
Thank you very much, Kaneta, for your really kind introduction, and to Lisa and to everyone at the Stephen Lawrence Centre for inviting me to speak today. And thanks to everyone who's come to listen. So it was a real pleasure to have the opportunity to read Bana Hesse's paper on multicultural transruptions. I really appreciated his concern with the question of what emerges both materially and in hegemonic British discourse in light of the embedding in the British psyche of what he speaks about as being amnesia about British colonialism, along with, of course, also the post-war fetishization of the British nation, which is made white through institutional structures, including law. I'm going to talk a bit today about the Grenfell Tower fire, trying to complement a bit Hessie's analysis of the post-war British context of colonial amnesia and institutional structural racism, focusing on the failure in the official response and formal accountability processes, and also thinking a bit about how communities have responded to this and what this might tell us about community organising against racial violence in the face of state neglect, violence and abandonment. So as we know, 72 people were killed in the social housing block fire on the night of the 14th of June 2017. I've written a bit before about how systemic issues lie at the heart of both why the fire happened, but also why there hasn't been justice more than 3 years later, why those in power have escaped accountability, and why families across the country continue to sleep in unsafe buildings night after night. So the systemic causes, including questions of racism, stigmatization, wider social issues that affect social housing communities, are left out of the scope of the official investigation into the fire. The Grenfell Tower inquiry, which began in May 2018, focuses on the immediate causes of the fire, and legal challenges to the narrow scope of the public inquiry were met with the argument that systemic issues are non-justiciable. Sir Martin Morbick, the chair of the public inquiry, stated that the inclusion of such broad questions within the scope of the inquiry would raise questions of a social, economic and political nature, which in my view are not suitable for a judge-led inquiry. Not apparent to the system are the causes of death that lie beyond the realm of the immediate. These official investigatory processes are often, as Shireen Razak has argued, structured to have little time for the past. And of course, in Britain, the past that matters is one of colonialism and transatlantic slavery. Patricia Tuitt, who wrote a chapter along with Monique Charles, who you've just heard from for our book After Grenfell, Violence, Resistance and Response, which came out a couple of years ago with Pluto, she's argued that the inquiry's effectiveness is going to be stunted for as long as it fails to reflect the diversity of the Grenfell Tower community in terms of both race and faith. The majority of those who died in the fire were racialized, many of them Muslim. Each time we are faced with the names of those who died or with assembled images of their faces, the fact that the vast majority of them are Muslim is inescapable. Although official inquiry documentation is made available in Arabic and Farsi alongside English, indicative of the victim's racialization, racial discrimination is not an issue under investigation. Tuitt has thus written that the Grenfell Tower residents, particularly its Black and Brown communities, have become inured to the spectacle of British judges holding just beyond their reach the powerful weapons of the law. So this delay and denial of justice for victims of racial state violence is something that is commonplace in Britain. One need only look at the tireless campaigning of families of victims, disproportionately young Black men who have died at the hands of the police, to see that this is the case. Despite thousands of deaths, there has never been a successful conviction of a police officer. Custody deaths are at the sharp end of racial state violence. Inquest juries have yielded victims of unlawful killing in 12 death in custody cases in Britain. But even in these cases, the officers involved have not been held criminally responsible. In a context in which colonial legacies of racism mean that the personhood of some people is denied, racial state violence itself becomes the work of the state. The violence of the legal system, we can see that violence in its inability to recognize the violence of its own agents. The stories we hear and see internationally of police shooting unarmed Black men, women and children bring home the reality that racialized people are disproportionately at risk of the most brutal forms of state violence as they move around white hegemonic spaces. But as the Grenfell Tower fire showed, racialized people are also acutely at risk of state violence in their own homes, places that we imagine should be safe of some of the forms of violence we find racialized people subject to by the state in public domains. But of course, as a result of austerity, deregulation policies and abandonment by state authorities, we saw the Grenfell Tower citizens made vulnerable to an extreme level of racial state violence. Why haven't we seen a riot or an official response, on the other hand, in the wake of Grenfell Tower fire is a question that has occupied my mind for some time. The racialization of the majority of the victims of Muslim, I argue, meant that the violence they endured did not compute as unacceptable violence, as an emergency, the emergency that it was, to the wider British public. Britain's colonial history, the war on terror, and recent imperial invasions have created a context in which violence against Muslims is normalized. So the violence suffered by the Grenfell victims was imaginable and therefore seemingly acceptable, failing to galvanize the wider British public. It's as though the violence of the fire has not registered either with the authorities or with significant parts of the spectating public. It was an imaginable sort of violence. And we've seen, of course, that this level of violence, even when it occurs in a 24-story tower block in London, in one of the richest places in the world, it can pass as violence that is unremarkable. And while it is true that there are similarly clad unsafe tower blocks up and down the country occupied by people who are white, what I think is that it's significant that the fire did not happen in one of those blocks. Had the victims of the fire been people against whom violence on such a scale is considered exceptional and unacceptable, the response and the preventative action the justice daily demanded might have been delivered by now. So what has been the community response? In the wake of the fire, when the bereaved and survivors were abandoned by authorities, the community came together with its own response, organising rescue, aid, food and shelter. The organisation of Grenfell United was created by the bereaved and survivors to campaign for safe homes, justice and change. As Karim Musili, whose uncle died in the fire, has said when he was speaking on the second anniversary of the fire, he said, "Pain unites us and pain also changes us." 2 years on and we're still neglected, abandoned by the government and other authorities that should have been there from day one. But I guess, had they been there, there would be no Grenfell United. Just to end, I wanted to say a few words about the relationship between the unprecedented Black Lives Matter uprising that we saw take place over the summer in Britain, following the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis on the 25th of May, and what happened in relation to Grenfell Tower fire and the response that has been mobilized since the fire by survivors and bereaved. So as I mentioned earlier, until now, it's been difficult for the Grenfell Tower victims to politically organise around questions of racism as a causal factor in the fire due to their racialisation as Muslim and the challenges that come with political mobilisation in the context of the war on terror for Muslims, coupled with the Grenfell Tower inquiry's exclusion of the question of race from its terms of investigation. In the course of the Black Lives Matter uprising, Grenfell survivors made the crucial connection between what happened to their loved ones and racial state violence in the form of police killings by making the point that their loved ones couldn't breathe either. Hisham Shuker, who's lost 6 members of his family in the fire, drew parallels between the killing of George Floyd and the fire when he said that when my sister rang the fire brigade, she said, "We cannot breathe." This is a similar phrase used in America at the moment. And on Monday, 6th of July, the words "we can't breathe" were projected onto Grenfell Tower. This was a really powerful action which made visible the fact that the violence the victims suffered is less identifiable as racial state violence, but it is in fact that. This development, to my mind, marks a powerful and necessary embrace of a coalitional anti-racist politics and an acknowledgement of the limitations and depoliticizing effect of formal challenge such as that of the inquiry. At the same time, it did send a powerful message to the inquiry and to authorities to recognise the role of racism as a causal factor in the fire. And indeed, the projection took place at the outset of the resumption of the work of the inquiry following its pause as a result of the pandemic. Leslie Thomas QC, who is representing a group of bereaved families, stated in his opening submission that the Grenfell Tower fire did not happen in a vacuum. A majority of the Grenfell residents who died were people of colour. Grenfell isn't inextricably linked with race. It is the elephant in the room. This disaster happened in the pocket of one of the smallest yet richest boroughs in London, yet the community affected was predominantly working class. That is the stark reality that cannot be ignored. He also drew a link with questions of race and poverty and the killing of George Floyd. So where the state fails or indeed targets communities for neglect and abandonment, we see people coming together, forming bonds of support and solidarity. We not only saw this in the wake of Grenfell, but with mutual aid groups that were set up in the course of the pandemic. Neighbours were united in pain and empathy. People took care of each other, fought for each other when the state neglected them. We should not underestimate the power of resistance that takes place along these lines of a radical ethic of care and practical support. These are radical bonds of solidarity and love that the state can't break. Thank you.
Thank you again, Nadine. Those were some really powerful comments that again remind us to pay attention about, in terms of thinking about Grenfell and sort of the ways in which survivors and the work that they do in the aftermath creates the space to keep race and racialization on the table as part of how we understand and process this tragedy and this disaster. And so that kind of tension between what the state is sort of doing in terms of trying to take race out of the equation and in the terms of reference of the public inquiry versus what is happening within communities affected by this tragedy is really, really powerful. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn to our last speaker for the evening, Amina.
Hi, good evening. Thank you to my colleagues at the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre for inviting me and organising these amazing panel of events, and also to my co-panellists. Quite a tough act to follow. So I guess in terms of my contribution today, I felt for me witnessing Grenfell was witnessing the inequalities, the sort of colonial continuation, the racialized, gendered and socioeconomic inequalities being borne out. And also, as Nadine says, witnessing this lack of care, the normalization of acts of violence against racialized and particularly communities who are racialized as Muslim, the lack of, the apparent lack of care and concern that existed in the wider community. And I got thinking, I guess Grenfell could have happened anywhere in Western Europe. I think that the conditions are there, both in terms of the socioeconomic exclusion and marginalization of racialized communities. And one of the particular examples I thought about, drawing on my own work as a comparativist specializing in Islamophobia studies in Francophone Europe, I thought of France. France, this nation that considers itself to be blind to religion, blind to color, blind to race, secular, promoting liberty and equality for all, but where marginalized, typically Black and brown Muslim communities often are, whose lives are characterized by exclusion, physical exclusions in terms of housing. They are often, they live in pockets of society, typically the banlieue, which is the often impoverished suburbs, living in social housing. They are often limited in terms of access to private rented accommodation or private housing. They are also excluded systematically from the labour force and education. And this exclusion particularly manifests along gendered lines and racialised lines. And these types of exclusion, particularly along lines of labour and education, further perpetuate and deepen the socioeconomic disparities that exist. So I really wanted to draw on the French context and to draw out some of the examples and the current developments that are happening there in relation to this question of politics of solidarity. And I think my paper draws on Professor Hesse's work, but also Professor Sayed's work in the first panel in this series. So by way of a brief background, a bit of a whistle-stop tour, the French colonial project was marked by the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, which encompassed notions of a white man's burden, but it was also characterized by the Code de l'indigénat, the indigenous code, whereby there were disproportionate legislative controls as part of the colonial project on colonized subject, particularly those racialized as Muslim. Within this, there were propaganda, posters and ceremonies with the taglines, dévoilez-vous, uncover yourself, unveil yourself. So there's been this long-standing obsession within the French context around Muslimness, and particularly around gendered Muslimness and its presence in society. Again, from this state that considers itself to be entirely neutral or secular. And when I think of these colonial iterations, of violence against racialized Muslim communities, the colonized communities, I'm minded to consider the current legislative measures that are enacted in France today, such as the 2004 implemented Loi Stasi, which bans ostentatious, in quote marks, faith symbols from schools. The reality of this ban meant that baptized Sikhs who wore the turban, but also Muslims, predominantly Muslims, were prohibited from attending school. Or you have the 2010 Loi Anti-Niqab, which was a banning of face coverings, which is somewhat paradoxical because this ban was framed as being a threat to security, a threat to secularization. But now everybody can wear a medical mask, and somehow that threat to security and secularism no longer exists. And all of these bans that exist and the affair, the scandals that have gone on around headscarves and long skirts and beards, and so on and so forth, not only have been co-opted by the right of the political spectrum, but also they're embraced by the left, the liberal. It is this idea of a very Spavakian sort of white man saving the brown women narrative that comes to play in France in particular. So what's the current situation in France? So currently in France, we're in the run-up to the 2022 French presidential elections. And I think this has really shown, recent developments have really shown that this will be powerful in exposing and also further normalizing France's racism. It will be exceptionally explicit and overt, and we've begun to see this already. So the previous presidential runoff was between the Rassemblement National, the former Front National, the National Front, and the left. And this is expected to play out again. So we're now seeing people like the Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, in debates with people like Marine Le Pen from the National Front, the former National Front, who Darmanin is accusing the National Front of not being strict enough on Muslimness in France. And Le Pen, from the Le Pen dynasty, is coming back and saying, actually, you know, we have freedom of faith in this country. The kind of position we find ourselves in terms of the acceptability of this hostility towards Muslimness is becoming increasingly overt. So back in 2020, the murder of Samuel Paty sparked national debate in France around freedom of speech, but also calls for dissolution of Muslim-centered and Muslim-led organizations. So you had organizations like Baraka City, but quite importantly, the Counter-Islamophobia Collective in France that was asked to dissolve. There was no clear evidence as to why this group was asked to dissolve. But nonetheless, I think it's important here to note that this was a community organization that was formed by Muslims, for Muslims, that advocated in legal cases, that documented the state of Islamophobia, that also called the state out on their Islamophobia. And there seems to be this direct targeting. There's also a clear contradiction here to French law, which allegedly guarantees all citizens under 1901 law, all citizens freedom of association. This is being increasingly cracked down on. There is an increasing shrinking of space in France for this sort of politics of solidarity to exist. In France, we also have the separatism bill, one that is allegedly supposed to reinforce these Republican principles. And I think here Republican principles is very arbitrary and quite meaningless in the same way we hear British values in the UK. And it was initially argued to be sort of a method or a mode of preventing separatism. So we have the recalling of the countering violent extremism narrative coming into play. But what it's doing is clearly separating out Muslimness from the normative French position. We have calls from the Prime Minister, the President, saying Islam is in crisis. There is increased normalization of this hostility towards Muslimness. There's a creation of a French state, the ideal of having a French state-sponsored secular vision of Islam. So not only are we having these modes enforced by an allegedly colorblind, race-blind, faith-blind state of how one particular group amongst many must practice their faith, we're also seeing the crackdown on their right to assemble, their right to associative politics. And the other alarming development that we're seeing in France is the debate around Islamo-gauchism, Islamo-leftism, where academics, scholars and thinkers are being penalized and facing increased censorship if they promote any sort of criticism towards the state position vis-a-vis Muslimness in France, but also criticizing colonialism is seen as allegedly Islamo-gauchiste, and you're seeing this guilt by association coming into play. So I guess the question I ask myself in relation to these developments in France, what are the prospects for this solidarity? And I would argue that it is definitely there at the grassroots level. It is definitely strong. There is a definite recognition among some pockets of society that this sort of racialization, state violence, state hostility towards particular racialized communities is unacceptable. But at the same time, the French state is coming down increasingly harder and harder to restrict these spaces for solidarity. And I think to really conclude, one of the points that springs to mind from the podcast that the SLRC kindly shared as part of the promotion for this event with the activist from the Counter-Islamophobia Collective in France, Marwan Mohammed, who said, concluding points to our podcast was that if there's anything to learn from the French situation, that this is potentially the barometer, in the same way that Adam talked about the Britain incorporating the US modes. I think we do a lot of the Frenchness as well. If France is potentially the barometer in terms of what can be done, what kind of state violences can allegedly be legitimately imposed, it also, for community activists and academics alike, it's a lesson in what not to do, where to react, and when to protest to avoid this increased crackdown and shrinking of space. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Amina, for those comments. I think you raised a number of questions about sort of thinking through, how do we imagine possibilities for certain kinds of solidarities within the context of, I was really struck by the way you talked about sort of the way that the state is organizing sort of a systemic way of kind of shrinking space for certain kinds of solidarities to arise. I'm actually gonna, one of the things I'm gonna sort of do is just sort of pose some questions that sort of come up for me in relation to all of the panelists as we move into our moderated discussion. One of the things, though, that I will say before we turn back to the panelists is that Amina is our last speaker, and we were initially slated to have another speaker, Dr. Muna Abdi, join us, but she was not able to tonight. So I just wanted to acknowledge her labor in preparing to be here for tonight, and just mark that she was not able to join us. But we do wish her send her well wishes tonight, and wanted to let her know that we're thinking about her. I'm going to sort of move towards just kind of backtracking a bit and going back to Adam and just kind of walking through the panelists and raising a couple of questions that can kind of begin our conversation tonight. One of the things that really struck me, Adam, about your presentation was you talked a lot about sort of the ways in which the US provides a kind of counterpoint, or the ways in which the US is constructed as a counterpoint sort of works as a way to kind of create a particular kind of narrative about Britain as a nation, Britain as a state, Britain as an arbiter of sort of anti-Blackness. And one of the things, though, that you also talked about is the ways in which there is a disavowal of race that happens also through class, or through the invocation of class. And I sort of wanted to hear you say a bit more about that, because I do think that is sort of a common thread that we sort of see operating a lot in terms of trying to shore up this idea that race and racism are sort of off the table in a British context, or not sort of modes of analysis that we need to sort of think critically with. Now, I think there's a larger genealogy of work that sort of, shows the relationship between that, but I would invite you to say a bit more about that. With that in mind as well, though, I also was really struck by what you had to say about the ways in which 2020 and the summer of 2020 is doing some critical work around historicizing a kind of, or sort of actually sort of providing a kind of counter narrative against the ways in which history is oftentimes used as a way to create that narrative around Britain as an anti-racist space, and sort of the ways that sort of narratives around abolition and have sort of functioned to do that work, and how the summer of 2020 creates an opportunity to kind of interrupt that kind of historicization of the nation, and doing so in ways that actually draw connections between the shared colonial histories of the US and the UK, which oftentimes that counterpoint narrative actually erases the fact that, US racial histories, if we want to think about it in those national terms, are also rooted in a kind of imperial politics that brings us back to British colonialism. Monique, one of the things that I wanted to invite you to say a bit more about is in relation to your point about what is music, and I thought that was just like a really interesting. You were sort of saying I was sort of got back to this question about what is music and what does it do, and you talked about this idea of music providing this kind of sonic footprint, almost a kind of archive of sorts. And this is the historian in me kind of talking, and I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about that, as well as maybe if you want to give us some more insights on the ways in which you have been able to sort of see music operate as a way to build solidarities, and maybe solidarities that do have the potential to have a kind of staying power and sustainability. Are there some modes of the ways in which music gets mobilized that we may be able to make that leap from different platforms like the digital realm into actually something operative on the ground? And I was just sort of wondering, maybe if you wanted to say a bit more about that. Nadine, one of the things that really sort of struck me, and I said this in my immediate comments afterwards, was sort of thinking about the political work of the survivors' responses to Grenfell, and almost the ways in which they're sort of articulating a narrative around victimization that's being denied, and that is centering a kind of project around understanding the process of racialization. I was also really struck by the ways that you said that Grenfell didn't register as a type of unacceptable violence. And I found that a really sort of, moving way to think about the kind of erasures that are sort of happening around Grenfell. And I wanted to invite you to say a bit more about what is that kind of idea of kind of not being registered as a kind of acceptable form of violence, or really an acceptable or an imaginable victim of sorts. What is that telling us about how the process of racialization works? And so I just wanted to sort of open that up for you. And then for Amina, one of the things that just really struck me in your opening comment, right when you started, is sort of bearing witness. And I actually kind of want to invite us all to sort of think about how we bear witness to some of the things that we've talked about tonight, whether it's Grenfell, whether it's, sort of looking at the ways in which the strictures around the politics of certain kinds of solidarities are working in the French context, and how bearing witness sort of plays into the ways that we are sort of developing a kind of critical analysis around what is happening on the ground. I also, sort of wanted to know in a little bit more, and invite you to say a little bit more about the ways in which you mentioned sort of the ways in which grassroots organizations are sort of calling out the state on forms of Islamophobia. And I would definitely invite you to say a bit more about what that looks like. What is that discourse? How are they actually framing the problem of the state in relation to the persistence of Islamophobia there? So I'm going to just open up there, and I'll start with Adam, and then we can sort of go around from there and move the conversation forward from there. But thank you all for fantastic presentations.
Thanks so much, Kanessa, for those reflections. It's really helpful. And I think I might want to draw on things that other people have said as well, because I think there are loads of really interesting thoughts and contributions. But I guess this question of class is a really important one. And it makes me think of maybe 2 or 3 things that I think are particularly important. Sorry, one moment. I think that one of the things that I think is a problem in relation to class politics in Britain is the idea that there is we need to analyse race or class. I remember a very senior professor in this country saying to me once, Adam, do you think that the issue of housing in Britain is about race or class? Because I think that it's about class, but in America, I think it's about race. And I think this does obviously a profound disservice to the material reality of people who are both racialized and classed and face those kinds of issues. But also it does a profound intellectual disservice to the fact that we don't live simply under capitalism, we live under racial capitalism. And the way in which racism is a fundamental tool of capitalist extraction and exploitation. But I think there is another issue as well. And I think the other issue is the way in which forms of liberal anti-racism also feed into this false dichotomy of race or class. And the manner in which we see forms, whether it be the kinds of politics we might associate with government policy and civil servants in the public sector, or through NGOs and forms of charitable sector, but also sections of academia and thought and community organisations as well, create the impression that racism is a disease which needs to be extracted from an otherwise fair and equal society. And the idea that we live in a kind of meritocracy where there are institutions where racism can be educated away or trained away or unconscious bias away. And then once we've done those kinds of things, everything will kind of be fair and normal and legitimate and just and what have you. And so I think both of these kinds of issues in relation to not seeing the closely knit, the intrinsically bound relationship between race and class, both on in much of what we might call the white or mainstream left, as well as in currents of liberal anti-racism, I think require addressing in relation to that particular issue. In relation to your point about historicising, I think that's a really, of course, important point that I know your own work has drawn upon, but many other people here speaking this evening. And I think that one of the things that's drawing those connections, those kinds of transatlantic connections does, in addition to drawing and highlighting upon Britain's historic relationship with the United States, and that being a relationship, of course, of settler colonialism and of imperialism, is also identifying the fact that there are continual relationships with global racial capitalism between Britain and the United States, whether it be the special relationship in relation to Britain's foreign policy and its close foreign policy relationship with the United States, or the fact that, of course, it's an active participant in forms of structural adjustment and other forms of ecological and environmental degradation across the global south. And I think, therefore, one of the really powerful things that we can do in drawing those interconnections of the problems that we face, or as of course one of the things that's arisen this summer, is drawing upon the interconnections of the solutions that people are imagining and are working towards. And I think the influence of abolitionist thinking that's emerging, particularly out of Black feminist scholarship in the United States, which is articulating the necessity of imagining a world in which we no longer rely on police, prisons and borders, and the manner in which we can erode society's reliance on those police, prisons and borders in ways which can take us closer to that revolutionary vision, I think further underlines the urgency of this kind of international as well as historical thinking.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn now to Monique.
Okay, thank you. I should also say thanks for having me. I kind of launched straight into my talk and my disclaimer and didn't thank you guys for obviously having me here. So I am happy to be here, just for the record. When you were kind of going or kind of summarizing the points that everyone has made, again, I came to space when I was thinking about what Adam was talking about, Black Lives Matter 2020. You know, a lot of the systems and structures, and I keep talking, I suppose, in that kind of broad brush way, impact different people and their ability to move through space. In a pandemic, we are also affected in the ways in which we can move through space, which also can make it acceptable to wear a medical mask to move through space. Whether these things are right or wrong, these are just kind of things that come to mind. And without being able to move through space, I mean, as a sociologist, there are things, or, you know, academics, depending on the discipline, there are some things that we may know or study, that certain people from certain backgrounds are more likely to, you know, be in the poverty bracket or be in a particular type of labor force, all these sort of things. The space that this pandemic has forced everyone in kind of uncovered all of these things that many of us have been researching or are kind of aware of as well. So I think it kind of, the pandemic and the inability to move through space made people more aware of George Floyd, whereas if people were able to move through space, they wouldn't be faced with these things, which, although people have obviously been doing activism and using intangible digital space and on the ground work, this pause for everybody and their ability to move through space kind of made it a possibility, or it was kind of in your face. People kind of had to deal with it. So that's just a thought that just kind of is a floating or hanging there for me there. And I suppose because it is this pause and this space, it does something to time and history. So I know you're talking about this kind of a historical moment or thing that was happening as a result of you know, in terms of abolition and all these sorts of things. Again, it comes to me, this space, we're being hindered, we are all being hindered moving through space, even though it still affects different people differently. In terms of what is music, I think that was one, well, that was ultimately what I came to through my own PhD research. So my PhD research was on grime music, and by you know, by looking at it and speaking to people, listening to music and understanding people's creative processes, you know, music, especially this DIY music, is an articulation of the soundscape where you live, what makes sonic sense to you. It's also lyrically what you have to say verbally. It's how you deliver it. So if we think about Dizzy Rascal, that kind of high-pitched yell, overall this fast sound, this kind of multi-layered lo-fi in a city, you know, you're trying to be heard. It's the influences of your parents and grandparents, what they listened to growing up. It's also what's cool now, what technology enables and doesn't enable. So ultimately, when you put all of this DIY stuff together that people have made to kind of articulate, this is their existence. So it's interesting you talk about archives. I almost call music, it is like an archive, and you know, so you can get an idea of technology at the time, what was important to people socially, culturally, politically at the time, all that sort of stuff. So that's what I mean when I talk about music is an articulation of existence. I call that a sonic footprint timestamp. And initially it was for grime, but other genres of music have used it to try and understand and make sense of what it's saying about a collective consciousness or group of people. So it is, but music is transient, so it is doing all of this kind of work. And I suppose the people that are the artists that become known can operate as organic intellectuals. This sort of argument has kind of been bandied around before. So it can galvanize people to vote or not vote or do various things. So I interviewed Loki for the chapter in After Grenfell, and he said, you know, we encourage the young people to vote. We encourage people to do stuff on the ground. So if you have some kind of position in music, because of the way that it engages and connects with us, it can kind of give you a degree of political power or to galvanize people. So there is that. For the people on the ground, I mean, this is the function of music. It's kind of cathartic nature, its ability to heal. And I'm a sound therapist, so I do use it kind of for healing, meditation, and all that sort of thing. It may not necessarily do the it does the temporary work that kind of sustains that person for a moment. It holds them for a moment so they can get up and fight another day, or you know, group together another day and kind of push. And you know, I was thinking about the points that both Amina and Nadine were talking about, and of course I did say, you know, it's class. Of course it's not just class, and I do think I did say that. But when we think about racialization, what underscores that is who are worthy and unworthy victims. And so, you know, if we think about, you know, Islamophobia and how it's developed, I mean, even around that time, you know, there is certain press, which I don't necessarily want to give, you know, name and give promotion to, but they were talking about the Beatles. And did you know in this very same area, these, you know, these particular 4 people were terrorists, you know, so this kind of, this minimizing of the pain under this banner of racialization, and that can be considered controlling, like a controlling image or controlling narrative, or trying to control people's rightful anger or upset or demands for justice as well. So these kinds of narratives are controlling narratives. What was the other thing? I think there was something else I was going to say, but it is actually slipping out from my brain because I do lots of things just off the head. But yeah, I think those are some of the additional points that I kind of think I wanted to add there.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll still, as a panel, continue to pick up on some of what you're saying there. And there's some comments I see coming through around that question of that sort of framing about thinking about what is music and the ways that we imagine what it is, how it works, and its function in particular kinds of ways. So thank you for that. Nadine, I wanted to turn to you next.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the comments you picked up on, and also I saw the banner come across with the question from Natasha around why is this unacceptable treatment of Muslims continuing, which I think connects to your question around victimization. I think what I'd say is that, you know, in order to be seen as a victim of violence, one has to be considered human, and I think that we're not always talking about the same thing when we use the word human. And so to put it crudely, but I think truly, is I think that Muslims are not considered human. I think that the level of violence that Muslims have been subjected to, if we think about the imperial wars that we've seen in recent times, so if we're not even thinking around the history of colonialism and the way in which, you know, in the Enlightenment era, people were categorized as being human or non-human on the basis of whether they were white European or not. I mean, of course we should, and I do go back to that history in my own work. But if we're just thinking about the contemporary British psyche and the inability to empathize with or to register violence on a scale like Grenfell as violence when it happens to people who are predominantly racialized as Muslim, I think we have to think about the Iraq War. We have to think about Afghanistan. We have to think about how Syria, we have to think how millions of Muslims died with no justice process following, no registering of that level of mass violence, mass death, with no recompense, with no, almost without a blink in relation to the extent of how extreme that the casualties of those imperial wars were. If we think about that, then I think we can then understand Grenfell. We can then see, well, if people are constantly faced with images of the typical victim, or a victim who is worthy of being a victim of violence who you don't need to worry about because ultimately they're either terrorists or they will be terrorists when they grow up, which is the position of the Muslim in contemporary political space in the media. And I think we know that not only from imperial wars, but also the way in which the militarized border regime impacts on racialized people who are, again, predominantly Muslim. If we think about the way in which the European border, Fortress Europe, etc., impacts racialized people. So I think that, yeah, we need to be able to understand people as human first to be able to register violence. And so I think that answers the question of why why the violence against Muslims doesn't register as being something that isn't remarkable. I think that people saw women in hijabs, brown faces of young of men and children, and these are people who we're familiar with seeing as victims. And, you know, there's a lot of research, which I don't need to go into, but there is, of course, research, if you're interested on that level, of into which demonstrates that white people feel empathy and humanize, and their ability to humanize others correlates with implicit racial biases, with negative stereotyping of those of darker skin corresponding to a lower level of empathy shown. And then, of course, when you think about what comes of empathy, well, what comes of empathy is cooperation and assistance between human beings. Whereas if there's an absence of an ability to identify the suffering of others, then that leads to violence and abuse. So again, I think just, you know, those sort of simple reference points, calculations, we can kind of see what happened there in relation to Grenfell. And then, of course, on the point of resistance and the kind of claiming of the, I guess, you know, what the families were doing with the projection of we couldn't breathe on Grenfell Tower is precisely saying we are also humans that couldn't breathe. And this is in the wake of seeing a kind Black Lives Matter as a, you know, as a movement that is seeking to humanize Black people. I mean, that is also what that is about. Say Black Lives Matter is to say we are human. When you kill us, we feel pain in that process. We can't breathe. Stop doing it. This is also what I think the Grenfell Tower residents were saying, is that, you know, the same kind of racial violence, it might be in a slower form in the sense of the structural conditions which led to the Grenfell Tower took place over decades, are less visible than the sort of video that goes viral of a horrific white police killing of a Black man that we see in relation to some death in custody killings, especially in relation to those that happen in the US. They were saying that this is the same kind of violence. So I think that drawing those connections between or in the discourse of victimhood is really important and can have this kind of empowering and coalition and collective making force behind it. Of course, you know, I also don't want to become too embedded in the notion of victimhood. I think that if we become too attached to our victimhood and it becomes an identity, then I think that becomes more problematic again and poses challenges to political organizing. But I think that at the point that racialized people, particularly Black people, particularly Muslims, are not even considered as human in many fora, then I think that sort of need to awaken a level of empathy, or to at least acknowledge why there isn't empathy in those contexts, is really important.
Thank you for that. It makes me think about sort of this notion of how we think about the operation of discourses of victimhood. And I've been even thinking about in my own work, James Baldwin's work about sort of the victim who is able to articulate the conditions of victimization ceases to be a victim, but it really becomes this threat, right? This threat to the status quo, which I think is a powerful framing around how we're thinking about the ways in which these discourses actually work to actually to create forms of empowerment, when oftentimes I think sometimes we too quickly dismiss victimhood as only a status of disempowerment, and it's sort of a kind of can be an act of kind of reclamation around humanity and articulation of a kind of recognition of humanity, and sort of opening up possibilities for mourning that which, you know, is being rendered or seen as disposable. So that is, like you said, I think that's a really insightful framing there. I want to turn to Amina.
Thank you for the questions and the insights, Kaneta. I think I'll begin with the question around dehumanizing and the dehumanization of Muslimness. It feeds into the other points I'm going to say. And I think I completely agree with Nadine there that it is this historical project, but it's something that has continued, and it's continued without the blink of an eye. And I also think about the concept of human rights as a tool for potentially guaranteeing Muslim rights as well. And I don't think that it doesn't work. I think we need to be more creative in the ways in which we work with that, because I think that the point is that Muslims are not always seen as humans, and we see those sorts of failings We look at the European Court of Human Rights, for example, when cases in France that have been heard in the French courts then are taken up to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights can't guarantee the right to freedom of faith, or can't issue a judgment guaranteeing the right to freedom of faith. We see this failure on the grounds of human rights, but also that lack of humanization of Muslimness. And then I guess for me that then relates to this idea of bearing witness. To bear witness, I think in part is about seeing that humanity, humanizing those who have undergone or who have faced this violence, but also a call for empathy, and recognizing what has happened. But I think for me, it doesn't just stop. And for the activists I've worked with through the course of my research, I don't think it just stops at bearing witness. I think part of the work that needs to be done is that speaking out, that documenting. I think that the road is long. And so then that brings me on to the grassroots organizations that are calling out the state. And so in the work that I've done around countering Islamophobia and forming these counter narratives, I found that sort of work in France, but across Europe, is incredibly diverse. So some of the types of contestation might be directly contesting state bills, policies, etc. But then also organizations such as the Counter Islamophobia Collective in France worked with, for example, women who we might not hear about in the media and so on, who faced employment discrimination on the grounds of their dress, accompanying these women, advocating for them in the courts. And then we have more creative and unusual strategies, employing arts, employing film, employing basically multi-level strategies that are employing everybody's strengths. And I think this is something I've seen from France, but across Europe, the idea that we all have a role to play in countering Islamophobia, but the broader anti-racist struggle, and that we could all draw on our own strengths, whether that's in academia, whether that's in countering government policy. And I think a lot of that is always being done, and it's about highlighting that and championing that, and recognizing the state will always push back, but that shouldn't deter us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one other thing, but before we transition, we're going to just sort of transition to take a couple of questions from the live chat. But one of the things I just wanted to invite maybe just a couple of you to comment on, and Amina, you raised this issue in your paper about sort of the stakes of academic work and taking up some of the questions and the politics of some of the work that you all are doing, and sort of the risks of that. And I do want to highlight, even in the last day, Barnard Hesse, whose work has sort of been a provocation for us, has sort of, we sort of really want to show solidarity, because, he sort of faced some backlash again around, articulating these sorts of ideas. And so, that, and I'm just curious about your responses to the ways in which the work that you're doing, and the ways in which you're doing, just sort of thinking about some of the political stakes of that. And Amina, since you raised it, I'll have maybe two of the other panelists. Maybe I don't actually. Amina, let's start with you if you wanted to say a bit more about that as well, and then if anyone else wanted to comment on that, I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think for me, a lot of the work even that we do as academics is a form of activism. Everything is, maybe I'm biased because I'm a lecturer in politics, but everything is political. And I guess that is then something we can mobilize to further the struggle. And then I think the struggle, and it's something I've said before, but it's something that transcends all of us. It is about this broader project. And that, it's about solidarity. It's about mobilizing those politics to do good through our work. But I'll hand over to the others. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if anyone else wanted to say anything in reference to that.
I just really want to second what Amina said. So particularly in relation to this chapter, it's not like slap bang in, I suppose, local slang, in the subject area that I write around. But for me, it was important to use my academic skill set to go to the community and give voice in a space in the academic space. That, like I said initially, the book may travel further than the people on the ground can, partly because they're on the ground doing that work. They haven't got time possibly to go to these places. It's a way to students, curious people can engage with this text and think about some of the key points and things that are raised. So for me, it was about amplifying and giving voice, but not being the voice of, which sometimes when you're doing this work, people want to position you as, oh, you're that person that did, and so that is something you have to navigate. But I agree, it's definitely about using your skill set to amplify and give voice, if nothing else.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna invite a question. We have a question from Carol Leeming. What are things what sorts of things do we need to do to think about, begin framing a new politics of solidarity in the current context? And I'm just inviting responses to that in terms of thinking about, in our current conjuncture, what does the mobilization of perhaps, does it require maybe new forms of solidarity in our current context? Adam, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there have been phenomenal examples of solidarity recently. I mean, I think Grenfell was a really important example of one that I'm sure Nadine and others can talk about in more detail. The fact that you have all of these different people from who might be people who weren't born in this country, who come from many different parts of the world, who have this shared experience of the legacies of empire and racism, and some of the things that bring them together, but also, of course, the ways in which their struggles are classed as well. But I think one of the other things that of course, we've seen in this country that we've obviously talked about already in 2020 was the way in which the protests that we saw weren't simply in big multicultural cities with big histories of anti-racist struggle. We saw large mobilizations in Liverpool and London and Birmingham and Bristol and Leeds and what have you. But we also saw them in small towns and villages, right? We also saw them in areas that have never really seen anti-racist mobilizations before. And I think that kind of politics of solidarity is something that's quite new. And I think it was Nadine and I have been working on a project where we've been talking through with each other, thinking through questions of nationalism and the legacies of empire, but also hope and struggle. And one of the things that we were saying in the group is that the target constituency of the nationalism that we've seen re-emerging following Brexit and then re-established by the Johnson administration, that target constituency of that nationalism has been the people in these relatively white towns and villages in more relatively rural areas of the country. And I think them coming out and protesting in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter marches in the big multicultural cities of this country, have them partly being saying no. We don't want to be part of this resurgent nationalism. We don't want to be the target constituency of this Johnson administration and this politics of Brexit. We want something different, right? We want to be we want to stand in solidarity with this anti-racism. And I think that's one of the most inspiring and beautiful things that emerged in recent months and years in this country that speaks to the necessity of a new politics of solidarity.
Mm-hmm. Nadine, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything at all about sort of almost what lessons can sort of thinking with the survivors of Grenfell teach us maybe about a kind of new forms of solidarities, or the ways in which solidarity, different kinds of solidarities happen and work and are mobilized.
Yeah, well, I think something that obviously hasn't been able to have happened during the pandemic in the way that it was before was the silent march, which of course is something that really marks Grenfell and the resistance to Grenfell in a way that is a very powerful mode of resistance of a surprising kind, because it is silence, but it is so powerful, and it can be heard much louder, I think, in the sort of way in which grief as as a collective activity, is also a really powerful act of resistance as well. And I think we also see that with the annual United Families and Friends demonstration that happens on the last Saturday of every month of every October every year, which is the organization that of families and friends of those who've died in custody. It's a national, the national campaign comes together also in that way of memorializing collectively. And I think those are moments for resistance. And I think one of the worrying aspects in relation to the pandemic has been grief on a mass scale in a context of mass state murder, abandonment, neglect on an absolutely horrific scale, with no ability for people to, or little ability for people to either acknowledge that level of grief and then come together collectively. And I think, so I think those are, I think, quite important modes of resistance that we've seen in relation to Grenfell. And then, of course, mutual aid is something else that came up in the past year, of course, the pandemic, which, like I said at the end of my talk, I think that those kind of bonds we build with our neighbors, with our with people who we may not usually speak to, but in a moment of crisis we do, and of course this happened in relation to Grenfell too. Those the state can sort of destroy a lot of what we do, infiltrate a lot of what we do, spy and surveil a lot of what we do, seek to destroy and divide and rule with time-honored tactics of destroying resistance and co-opting it as well, which was an attempt the government made in relation to mutual aid. So I think what we need to do is really hold dear those kinds of bonds of love, of community, friendship and care that emerge, and really protect them and safeguard them, because I think those are the kinds of things that we can actually protect from the state, and that will be lasting in the difficult times to come.
Mm-hmm. I really like the idea of thinking about moving towards the end of our session on this point of solidarities and sort of how we think about how they're framed. And so I did want to just invite Amina and Monique maybe to sort of offer some final comments as well that might allow us to think about the politics of solidarity in our current conjuncture and how it can work for us in this moment through some of the work that you're doing. Amina, do you want to go first, and then we'll end with you, Monique?
Thank you. I guess just echoing what my co-panelists have said and what I said before, I think that the road is long, but we are, as much as the state is trying to stamp down on those associative politics, on the freedom of speech when it's critical of the state, or that local activism and organizing, we are doing that. And I think, as Nadine says, it's something we should hold dear, and that it's a long journey, and that stay strong for that long fight and keep with it, I guess would be my final point. Thank you.
Monique?
Okay, so I'm gonna go back to my word of space. that is the word for me. So tangible space. If we think about Grenfell, we think about North Kensington. It was an undesirable space where undesirable people were left. They put a motorway over. As a concession, they allowed 1 mile either side of the Westway. The people of the area value that space, value the community that has kind of come up as a result of that. Knowing there was, for lack of a better term at the moment, a common foe, the authorities selling off this land that is community land in perpetuity. Space creates the love, it creates the collective consciousness, it creates the bonds. And once that space is taken away or people are moved to different areas, the culture or the outlook shifts for that group of people. So for me, it always comes back to space. And that's why I've been toying with the idea of how digital space and what's garnered there can come back into the physical. There, no doubt, people are still on the ground, putting in that work, supporting each other, fighting and pressing for justice, for change. But they need space in order to, if I think about, the civil rights movement, the Black church had a real, that space, access to that space gives the impetus for all of these other things to happen. So again, I go to how people can claim and hold space. The authorities are selling off space. The authorities were happy to let that space burn. They were happy to regenerate people out. People in North Kensington have been pushing and pressing to hold space. The library, they were going to, sell off the library. They pushed and, they resisted, and they've managed to hold their library for their community. So for me, it's that tangible space, being able to organize, being able to be, to share, to have that outlook, to have that existence. Music is like the intangible. To have that existence and find ways to sustain that in this long road, as Amina has said, is really important.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly powerful point to end on, and the thing that we often take for granted, right, before, in all of this. So I thank you for that. Thank you as well to this fantastic panel of speakers. Again, thank you for your time, your labor, and for really being present in this conversation. I just really, it was just such a pleasure to be in conversation with everyone here. So again, I cannot say thank you enough. As we close, I just want to remind everyone about our final episode of Unsettled Multiculturalisms. This series will happen next Wednesday at 5:30. And the topic for discussion that night will be looking at regional transnational Blackness. And I'm really excited to welcome again another all-star panel of thinkers that will be led in conversation by Dr. Pat Nuxolo. And that panel will also include Mark Christian, Sean Sobers, Carol Leeming, Chris Simba, and Francesca Sobande. So I am really excited to see the last installment, and I really appreciate the speakers' contributions for this evening. On that note, have a great evening, everyone.
I never learned from mistakes I always made. Those nights I cried, I never thought that I would make it. When love came down, it turned my head around. Sometimes when you are down and there is no one around, just go easy on yourself. Feel the love, 'cause it's coming from inside you, 'cause it's living everywhere. As you start a new beginning, open up your heart and let love in. You've got to feel the love. I've made a change to find the gifts that life has given. It makes me smile, so much joy